Welcome to another episode of Beyond Risk and Back. Thank you very much for joining me. Parents, teachers, clinicians, the fact that you are here when there are parents who should be here, when there are teachers who could be here, the fact that you're actually here tells me everything I need to know about you as a parent looking for support to work with your struggling teenager. I am your host, Aaron Huey. And I thank you to listen, like, subscribe, and share Beyond Risk and Back. We are 260 episodes deep into this educational experience of figuring out what we can do differently with our teenagers, with our families. And of course, parents, the work always will start with you. And I think today's show is going to be amazing. I have Lucas Reid, author, with us, and he's going to tell you his background. He's got a great background in mental health and understands a heck of a lot. And really what we're going to be talking about here is twofold. Number one, we are going to address and confront the issue of self-confidence, self-esteem, self-worth. But we're also going to look at it through the lens of DBT, because I will tell you, parents, and I'm going to start the show off saying this way, and I think as I got to know Lucas, he very much agreed. I, in 25 years, have never heard a teenager say to me, "Oh, DBT was great. Oh, yeah, no, I love DBT. That totally worked." Now, in no way, shape, or form am I trying to discount the value of DBT. In the same sense that I would never try to discount the value of the 12 steps. As a product of the 12-step rooms, as someone who has used DBT in his own facility for children, I know that aspects of it work. I know that it works very well for adults, but I'm not convinced it works that well with teenagers. And I believe we have found someone who is making the necessary changes to DBT to make it more accessible, usable, and to really support the way a teenager thinks, the way a teenager feels, and the way, most importantly, a teenager changes. Beyond Risk and Back audience, let's please welcome Lucas Reid. Lucas, thank you so very, very much for being on the episode today. I'm glad to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited for this show.
Me too. Lucas, why are you doing this work? What on earth happened in your life, or what did you figure out or see or experience that made you want to get in and do this work, especially for teenagers? How'd you end up here?
Yeah, so I've actually worked with teenagers for about 15 years, not in the mental health area, but as a tutor for college entrance exams, the SAT and ACT. And as I'm sure many of the parents here know, that is an extremely stressful process. And I really got to know how they think. Also, I started realizing how important my job was to help them manage their anxiety. And by the way, their parents do, but they need to be able to go in on test day and not have their brain going crazy. And they need to be able to stay 100% focused on the task at hand. And that started to become a big part of what I was teaching. I became so interested in their brains, though, that I then obtained a master degree, a Master of Science degree in Neuroscience and Education, because I wanted to understand more about how the brain actually works and particularly some of the feedback loops that we have. And I wanted to understand where that comes from. And I originally was focusing a little bit more on learning differences, but I came to become very enamored with emotion regulation. And we'll talk about that definitely today, but it's really something that's extraordinary that we're able to do. It's easier for adults than teenagers, but the studies have repeatedly shown that they have the ability to regulate their emotions as well, but they need to be given the tools. I also was not the greatest teenager in the world, and so I decided that I wanted to start doing some more research beyond what I learned in my degree classes, and decided that I wanted to write some books that in some ways are really just for my teenage self. And I hope that a lot of other people can really appreciate them and learn from them. And to me, it's extremely important that the books, although I know parents are going to read them first, but they're very, very much written to a teenager in what I hope is a relatable voice that I've learned how to use over the years, and with relevant examples and an understanding of what they're going through.
I have a quick question about the teenage voice. Like you, and one of the things that we connected on off the air was the fact that I took the 12 steps and two other colleagues of mine, and we sat down and we said, how's a teen going to hear this written as is? And how's a teen going to say this if they were teaching another teenager? What is the primary difference between the adult voice and the teen voice? Based on what you've studied and what you know from working with teenagers, how do parents miss it? What are they missing when they employ understanding things from the teen voice?
I think the biggest issue is teenagers don't know what they don't know. And the last place they want to hear anything from is their parents. So part of it is just the natural teenage need to be independent and belief that their parents don't know anything. So I think it's very hard for parents sometimes to communicate with them. And when parents are communicating with them, I can't speak to every parent, but I think sometimes parents are so much in a parent voice and not necessarily a relatable voice. And there's obviously a fine line between being a parent and being a friend. I think what is nice about someone like you or myself is that the teenagers respect us. We try to talk to them as adults, and give them as much agency as possible, but also explain what we want from them and why. And the why is really, really important. And I think that they have the reasoning ability that adults have to a large degree. And I think if you give them the information and make it relevant to their experience, relevant to their worries and concerns at that moment, and don't talk down to them, and then demand accountability as well, they tend to rise to that challenge. At least that's what I found in my career.
I have often found a couple things that agree with you. Number one, often when you raise the bar, they start doing pull-ups. And I like that. And for parents who are really struggling at times with their teenagers and their teenagers who seem to be caught in a spiral of risk, that seems to be the last thing they want to do. They're walking on eggshells, they're carefully picking words and choosing things. And sometimes it's just time to raise the bar and say, sink or swim, kiddo. And the kids swim. That's a big deal. The second thing you said that I love saying to pretty much every parent I ever get on the phone with is, look, mom, dad, I'm going to say the same things you've said. They're just going to listen to me because I'm not you. And it's very simple. But now, when we talk about this concept of a teen developing independence, do not want to listen to the parents' voice, input, advice. I find it incredible that developmental necessity and the time frame of the child's ability to get in lifelong level trouble, how they just collide. They just right away they come together. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a biological mistake in a way. Um, I mean, it's so all animals, by the way, go through a teenage phase. At least all mammals do. And if you talk to a dog trainer, they'll talk about the time when you think you've fully trained your puppy and he's doing everything right, and you're so happy and you have that great relationship, and then all of a sudden he starts tearing apart the furniture again, and it's like, what just happened? What did I do wrong? Well, actually, the puppy is going through adolescence and is trying to test you and push you. And so teenagers are the same. The big difference, though, is that the puppy is not going to then, drive drunk. So, I mean, all these risks that, we can completely control the environment of our dog, but not of our children. So, and that's the real challenge, I think, is to let them have the breathing room that they need to develop their personalities and their independence, but also a parent's job is, of course, to keep them safe and to teach them good values. So it's not easy, and that's why. I mean, I always joke that if I had a nickel for every time a parent said, "Will you talk to him because he won't listen to me?" I'd be a millionaire.
So now let's bring in the conversation of self-confidence, about building concept, as you and I were talking about before, esteem, worth, value. Um, does the detriment of value and confidence come at the expense of this developmental time frame, or is this a product of of their environment? Where do these issues show up?
Everybody has a different environmental upbringing, and there may be obviously parents or teachers who are not as supportive as they should be. But if I assume that, certainly the parents who are listening to this podcast are very much trying to be supportive, I think a lot of it is biology. And our brains can go into this isn't a technical term, but it's just the term I use, especially when I'm talking to teenagers, is they can go into what I call feedback loops. So basically, there's a part of your brain that all mammals share called the amygdala. You know this. And the amygdala evolved for the flight or fight response. It's basically alerts us to danger. If you suddenly go, when you hear a noise, that's your amygdala waking you up. And the problem is that all of the different stresses that we have as humans, and that especially teenagers have, the stresses of school, the stresses of fitting in, the social stresses, starting to date perhaps, all of that activates the amygdala because it's stress. But of course, if you're a caveman and a bear is attacking you, you really want that amygdala to be firing. But if you're, just trying to deal with life, it's not as helpful. And then what happens is you have an emotional response. You have a physiological response. You act in a certain way. And that's going to make things worse. And then the amygdala is firing even more. What anyone needs to do, including those of us who are having our own stresses and our own problems, but teenagers aren't told this or not necessarily given the tools, is we need to start by getting out of the loop. It's sort of changing the dialogue. And there's a lot of different aspects to that, but I think it's really important to try to create a more positive focused feedback loop. You need to choose to start to find a way to think more positively and to have the reward circuit engage instead of the stress circuit. And one thing that I think is interesting, something that I think is very common when we're trying to help someone develop confidence is say, well, hey, why don't you make a list of your strengths and your accomplishments so you can start to realize, how much value you have. Here's the problem with that. And it's an easy solution, but here's the problem with that. When you're in a funk and I say, hey, let me know your strengths, you're going to say, I don't really think I have any. Or you're going to say, hey, give me some of the accomplishments that you've had the last year over the years. I don't really think I've accomplished anything. So one thing that I have in my first book that's coming out and that I try to do with people is say, look, don't worry about your strengths and accomplishments. Write down a list of strengths and accomplishments and people you think highly of. Just make a list, free associate, and try to get a list of as many strengths and accomplishments as possible. And then say, okay, we have this list now. Check off the ones that actually apply to you now that you have them written down. And they'll say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I am caring. Like they just wouldn't have thought to put caring down when they're talking about themselves, but they'll put it down if they're talking about something else. Oh, yeah, I do help people. I did learn how to change the oil in a car this year. I did save some money, so it helps to sort of force them to move their minds without sort of saying, you have to do it this way. So it's giving them tools to sort of back into something.
That's a genius way past the I don't know. And that I don't know, that's always the first. In fact, with my clients, one of the things I do is that every time I hear the word I don't know, I find two things. Number one, they then tell me what they know. Uh, and number two, they stop doing it once I make them do 5 push-ups for every I don't know I hear. Yeah, because the body automatically wants to avoid pain. That's one of the issues that I see coming up, and I think this is a good bridge into the DBT, because now we're talking about writing things down. We're talking about tracking forward and tracking backwards when we're dealing with any issue confidence, esteem, why they practice some repetitive risky behavior despite consequences, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of parents, want to say, what were you thinking? And it's hard to tell the parents they weren't. Had they thought, and you said earlier, they don't know what they don't know. And had they thought, they might have thought of something that they heard of, but possibly maybe it could happen to them. So let's talk about DBT with all due respect to Marsha Linehan, who just a brilliant woman. And how many of us have come along through the years and created a psychological process that insurance companies require that you do? I mean, my God, she struck gold. And I got to ask you, Lucas, does it work for teenagers?
So let me start by saying that writing down is critical, and that's sort of what led us into this. So, for example, if I am not thinking about the consequences of an action, and I have a task to write down the action and the consequences and what I didn't like about the consequences, if I go through that process, it really opens my mind. And especially if you give them some examples ahead of time to help get their mind going, that can really open your mind. And again, it allows their reasoning skills to be engaged. So DBT has 4 pillars. And if you look at mindfulness, interpersonal relationships, emotional regulation, and distress tolerance, and if you look at Linehan's worksheets, or if you look at go online and find any other DBT purveyor and look at their worksheets, it is the size of War and Peace. Okay. And they have you going through exercise after exercise. So it'll be mindfulness lesson 1, mindfulness lesson 2, emotional regulation 14, emotion regulation 15. And they all touch upon each other and they kind of build on each other, but it's overwhelming. I find it overwhelming. When I was doing the research on DBT and thinking, how would I apply this to my own life? I honestly would have just said, this is too much for me to do. I don't have the time. And I am not in school all day and doing homework until night and trying to find time for my friends and trying to, do with all the other things teenagers deal with. So it needs to be simplified, not in the sense of taking out the brilliance of it and taking out the skills from it, but it needs to be presented in a teen-friendly way where they feel like they have the time and the ability and they understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and they can do it tonight. You have to do it repeatedly. I'm not saying that you do one worksheet and you're done, but that they can go back to that worksheet that's maybe a page or two instead of having to do 15 or 20 or 30 pages. The other thing is the way that DBT is structured is around these different pillars. So maybe today I'm going to have you work on emotion regulation. Maybe tomorrow I'm going to have you work on distress tolerance. And I think that if you're an adult going through 3 times a week therapy for 15 years, that's a possible way to approach things. And and the studies established with total clarity that it works. So let's, say that. But I think if you're a teenager, it makes more sense to say, what is my problem? My problem is I feel overwhelmed by anxiety. Okay, what are the specific DBT solutions that we can explain to you, have you prepare to deal with those anxiety attacks? Because a lot of DBT is preparation for the real thing, right? So they're in their room preparing, so they have the tools, the skills to deal with it later. Okay, my problem is I'm just get angry all the time and I just start throwing things. Okay, well, DBT can actually address that, but we don't need to send you into 85 worksheets for that. Maybe we can combine the skills that you need into a single worksheet and start to work on emotion regulation and identifying your triggers and so forth. So that's what I'm trying to do, is to try to make it more problem focused and to have the solutions be super, super targeted and friendly to a teenager, being aware of their lack of time and also their lack of patience with a lot of stuff like that.
At brabapp.com, parents, I have posted a parenting masterclass. Before you fast forward through this commercial, give me a chance because I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to keep it blunt. This is a Telly award-winning parenting masterclass. The content is everything I have ever taught a parent in the past 20 years of working with parents in crisis. There are 3 components to the course. 56 classes in 3 components. The red, the beyond risk, the crisis children. Yellow, the at-risk children. And green, when things are going well, how do we get them to go great or keep them going well? It's everything I've ever taught a parent in 20 years of working with families. But here's the deal. It's $99. I want every parent to be able to have access to this course. So please go to brabapp.com, B-R-A-B for Beyond Risk and Back. brabapp.com, B-R-A-B-A-P-P.com. Check it out for yourself. Aside from connecting with you directly, and of course, as always, we'll make sure that people can, when a parent hears from a treatment center or an acute unit or a therapist, I think your kid should become involved in a DBT workshop. If a parent is listening to the show and learning that this is going to be an overwhelm of work and worksheets and stuff, what can the parent expect to change, or what can they do to help their teenager connect to the work if you're not there to actually intervene?
So I think that, first of all, if a licensed mental health professional recommended that your child try DBT, I would never, ever say that person is wrong and don't do that. Okay. That would be professional insanity. Okay. What I might do, though, is say, so just as teenagers need tools, parents need tools too. And I think that it's completely reasonable to talk to the clinic and say, hey, can we find a way to distill this down to the essence and try to make it targeted towards my child's specific problems? Now, I know there's going to be group therapy, and it's harder anytime you're dealing with groups, it's harder to be completely targeted. But even just saying, look, I've talked to my son or my daughter, he or she is willing to give this a try, but realistically, they've got 20 minutes a day. Okay. Like, how do we make that work? I think we all just get into this is how it's done. And if you said to a clinician, can we design this in a way that can be done repetitious, but just 20 minutes a day? I think they'd be like, oh yeah, absolutely. Let's make this work for your child, because they have your child's best interest at heart. So I think it's just communication. You would never go to a doctor and have the doctor tell you a long list of treatments that you have to do or medications that you need to take without saying, okay, can we talk about that? Why? Like, is there a different way? Worst case scenario, cancer. Well, are there other therapies? I keep reading about immunotherapy. Is that an option? So it's sometimes you just want to find out, is there a different or better way that works for me?
Have you ever seen dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, really be the cornerstone of somebody's recovery?
So I'm still very new to the DBT world. I have been doing a ton of research on it lately, and I'm deep into trying to reinvent it in a teen-friendly way, but I haven't finished that process yet. I have a very clear, I know what it looks like. I know what it's going to look like at the end, but it's so important to execute it properly and to make sure that, especially because it's going to be so targeted and the worksheets are going to be so short, it has to be absolutely spot on, right? And that's a lot of work and thinking. So I don't think I'm qualified yet to answer that question that I've seen or not seen. I do know that the way that I try to help my tutoring students deal with anxiety, I think, is a combination of general principles of emotion regulation and a little bit of DBT, which includes emotion regulation. But there's a lot to be said. For example, just to give you a really basic example, I tell students, when you sit down for the test, and this could be a test in school too, but I'm mostly focused on SAT, ACT. When you sit down for the test and you hear that sonic boom of pages opening, because everyone, that proctor says go, and it's like all of a sudden 25 people go to page one. And to me, that's one of the most stressful sounds in the world, right? I find that a terrifying sound. So, what I tell people to do is to say, to not engage in that, not to open your booklet yet, to take a deep breath, to say, okay, I'm ready for this. I've done the prep to get yourself into a mindful state and then to open it. So you've skipped that part where everyone's making a mistake on the first three questions because they're hyped up. So I think that that things like that are they sound very little, but I think they have a big impact and they help people. So I guess my goal is to make DBT smaller, but as impactful.
I have a personal question that I want to know your answer to, but I also feel that parents whose kids are really struggling would want to know this from you as well. And you and I hadn't talking about this subject when we agreed to do the show. So I'm going to come out of left field here a little bit. When I saw my PSAT scores, when I saw my SAT scores, when the college I wanted to go to saw my scores, it was pretty clear I wasn't going to college. And back in the 80s, this was 80, 86, 87, that those things were happening for me. It was still pretty much the be all end all. These were the markers. Well, I had plenty of extracurricular. My grades in junior and senior were fine, but I had also structured my courses that I really enjoyed school. I got all my necessities out of the way very quickly and then really enjoyed the second half of junior and my entire senior year. But my confidence took a massive hit and I didn't go to college. I became a very successful businessman. My wife and I own a lot of real estate. I do this show, which I love with my heart. How much have you seen parents' connection to education and good SAT and ACT scores being one of these things that contributes to confidence, esteem issues?
These tests are brutal for kids. And, I'm fortunate that I'm able to help kids improve a lot and do well or do at least better than they would have done. But the entire process is just so stressful for them because it is, in many ways, like learning a skill. Learning to take these tests. They are coachable, but it is a very, very stressful process. And I'm not entirely convinced that these tests tell that much about who you are. I know that they don't tell you who you are as a person, but I don't even believe that they say what kind of a student you're going to be. My colleagues, for years, we used to say if colleges would finally stop taking these tests, I'd be out of a job, but I would have won the war.
That's huge to hear. I mean, someone who has ADHD as I do, who could study for a test up into the moment you hear that thunder of flipping to page one and literally forget everything you were just reading and memorizing for the past week. Someone who has utter anxiety walking into any testing environment, pretty much convinced I'm already going to fail it. How do I get my kid utilizing your concepts of DBT, skilled for, retooled for the teenage brain, and what you understand about confidence and esteem? What as a parent should I give me three things that I can do when my kids starting this testing process?
I think that there are sort of two issues of confidence when you're dealing with these tests. There's obviously your general sense of confidence, and that's something that hopefully you're working on or we're helping kids to develop throughout their teen years. But then there's the confidence for the specific task, and that's sort of what I tell people is it's very easy to talk to athletes about this or actors because when you go in to play the game, you've prepared, you've been coached, you know what you're doing, you have the muscle memory to do it. And you don't, I mean, everyone chokes sometimes. Professional athletes choke, right? It's the yips. But basically, you don't go in and fall apart because you know that you can do it, right? Same thing with an actor. Okay. You've learned your lines, you've learned your blocking, you've rehearsed, you've had your dress rehearsal. You're not going to fall apart, but you're going to be anxious. That's okay, but you're going to be confident. And so when it comes to a specific task, as opposed to sort of my general perception of myself, it's so important to believe that you know how to do the task, whether it's taking the SAT or performing in the school musical or shooting the basket. It's the same thing for any academic test, by the way, but there's a big difference between academic tests and these standardized tests. Every academic test that you're ever going to take is going to be different from the last one you took, because you're going to have new content, different content, and you kind of have to figure out what your teacher wants from you. And that sort of creates its own anxiety, right? When you're taking a standardized test, if you've prepared for it and you really understand how the test works and you understand how to play the game, because it is in many ways a game, every single test that's ever been given in recent, at least within the last 3 or 4 years, is essentially the same. It's not literally the same, but it's essentially the same. So just like if I know how to shoot a basket, I know how to shoot a basket. If I know how to take the ACT, I know how to take the ACT. So you can actually develop a test specific confidence, but you have to believe that you know what you're doing. And that's again where I think I told you the joke that I always tell myself, at least, and some parents who have good senses of humor, that I tutor kids for free, but I'm paid for therapy. And because a lot of it is just getting them to believe. I mean, I have someone right now I'm going to be speaking to right after this, and she did so well on a practice test the other day. It was the best she's done, and she should have just been thrilled and proud of herself. And she said to me, "So I'm worried that I won't be able to do that again." Right? And that's exactly wrong. You've done it. You did the work. You've succeeded. Of course you can do it again. But if you go in with that thought, guaranteed you're not going to do well. Like you can't go in where your brain is in this feedback loop of I can't do it. It doesn't work that way. In fact, you have to have your brain 100% focused on I can do this and I know how to do it and I'm doing it right now, and to stay present. So her test is a week from Saturday, and we will be spending a lot of time on mindset, a lot more than the test.
Let's give parents your contact info. How can parents find you? How can they connect with you? Whether it's for tutoring or the confidence or the DBT retooling, which it all seems very related, Lucas.
My Facebook page is Lucas Reid 400. Apparently, there's a lot of Lucas Reids out there. And they can always hop on there, Facebook/Lucas Reid 400. And they can either send me a direct message if they don't want, or they just want to post something there. Also, I'm going to give everyone who is listening to this the opportunity to have a free copy of my book that's coming out soon, which is my Self Confidence for Teen book. And also in a few months, my DBT skills for teens with anxiety, anger, or loneliness. So I'll hopefully I'll send you what needs to be in the information below, but they'll be able to click on a link and I'll be happy to provide them with whichever or both books if they like, just for being here and supporting you and listening.
Confidence, self-esteem, the SATs, dialectical behavioral therapy. What I really appreciate about Lucas is his ability to talk about so many different aspects of what a teen is going through at such a critical juncture. To be dealing with a kid who's not only going through the at-risk experience, maybe even the beyond risk experience, while they should be prepping for college or could be prepping for college. This is what I think Lucas really brings to the table here with his work and his understanding of looking at these questions, looking at this practice. And I love what he said. What he said. You know, he tutors for free but gets paid for therapy. Absolutely makes a lot of sense.
I just want to say that I think it's so much harder to be a teenager today than it was when I was a teenager. Not the least of which is social media, but I think there's so much more pressure on kids academically. I think there's so much more pressure with these tests. I think, especially if you're college bound, what you're supposed to put into your application is insane, like what you're supposed to present. And then you have social media on top of all of that. And, there's great things about social media. We're talking about it right now on Facebook and all, but kids definitely need help to be resilient in the face of all of that.
Lucas, do parents put too much pressure on their kid around the ACTs and SATs?
I'm here in New York City, and we live in a bubble. And I don't want to blame the parents specifically. The world that we live in here in New York City puts way, way too much pressure on kids. Everyone thinks that there's about 10 or 15 colleges, that if you don't get into those colleges, you're doomed, which is so far from the truth. And I mean, ask any person in, master of the universe, ask Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan or anybody, where did your employees go to college? He's going to be like, I have no idea. It's not something that people really focus on after you've gotten your first job. But in this bubble here, yeah, it's pretty intense. Now, I'm sure there's lots and lots of places outside of New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, where people are a little bit more calm about this kind of thing. And, obviously lots of kids go and are highly successful in their state school and stuff like that. But I do live in a very strange bubble here.
I mean, I'll be honest. I think the entire East Coast is a strange education bubble, like what you're saying. Being from Colorado, it didn't have this feeling of pressure. It was important. Yeah, and it's important. It's an important life decision to make. But Lucas, I was brought in many years ago to help counsel a small village in India where 90 children had attempted suicide, and after failing a very difficult test. And you can imagine, with 90 attempts, there were a lot of very successful suicides, and the whole village was distraught. And when I was asked to present my thoughts on it, my first thought, and I said, this is really going to be hard to hear, but if your child's experience right now can become a lesson for future parents, it's very simply this: if you make school a life or death matter, so will they. And we're still dealing with a child's brain. We're not dealing with an adult's brain who, as you said very brilliantly in the beginning of this conversation, what they don't know, they don't know. And if all they're told is you have to go to college and one of these 14, 17 schools, and you have to get good ACT and SAT, had I believed that, I would not be successful today.
One of the examples that I have in talking about putting things into perspective and dealing with setbacks and that sort of thing, because kids aren't necessarily taught how to deal with setbacks. It's just sort of, you're supposed to know. But I give the example, which we all know, of the kid who got an A- on a history test and burst into tears. And my question to the reader is, was that a rational reaction? And most readers are going to say no. Teen readers are going to say no, of course not. I would love it if I got an A-, or is that kid insane? But every single teen probably has their own version of that, where they're having that extreme reaction to something that didn't warrant such an extreme reaction. And that's part, again, of sort of changing your mindset and thinking in a different way, having some perspective. And again, if you don't know to have perspective, you're not going to have perspective. And yeah, we as adults have to help them with that.
I think what's really important that Lucas said was that every kid's got their version of the A-, that unreasonable reaction to perceived failure. This concept of perceived failure is not something that they necessarily invented. This is what I mean when I tell the families that the child is speaking the family language out loud. If we are going to make the education the key to their identity, then if they're bad at school, imagine how their identity will suffer. Imagine what you would have to say to them to convince them that not getting into the college of their choice is going to be okay, that you trust in their ability to make this work, to hustle up a good job, career, or business idea where they can be successful. Because so much of the fear behind education that lends to our children's low self-esteem, self-worth, and self-confidence is the idea that we're afraid and we are parenting from that fear point, and they have taken our fear to mean that we don't trust them to figure this out. One of the best gifts my parents ever gave me, when I would bring them home a problem that I was having, was that they handed me the problem back and told me I would figure it out. coming up with strategies to fix problems and deal with issues is dialectical behavioral therapy. And that's what we were talking about. That is the process of DBT. Is workshopping and worksheeting why things happened and what we're going to do the next time they show up. This is what Lucas is talking to us about. This is what he's brought to this episode. I want you to go to lucasreid400.com and follow up on this guy's work, because what he's doing around education, around confidence, and for DBT so that our teenagers can really access us. And I will say this again, I said this at the beginning of the show, 25 years I've watched kids do DBT. Never once have I had someone say, oh yeah, that was it. That's what did it for me. It's a valuable tool. It is a brilliant process. And it's another tool that you must have in your toolbox. Teens need it too, and it needs to be tooled for teens. Parents, you got to take care of yourselves first, your adult relationships second, and your children third. That's how we do our best work with our kids. No more fear parenting. Take your house back. Get your nervous system back online first. Strongest nervous system wins. And I'll see you next week on Beyond Risk and Back.